The auditorium lights dimmed as Barron Trump stepped onto the stage, his tall, slender figure casting a long shadow across the polished wooden floor. At 19 years old, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that belied the storm of scrutiny that had followed him since childhood. The Harvard University debate hall fell silent, the air thick with anticipation and judgment. 300 pairs of eyes tracked his every movement, some curious, others openly hostile. This wasn't just any campus debate. It was his first major public speaking event since entering college, a moment that would either define him or break him. The topic, the children of political figures, fair game for public criticism? The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. For years, Barron had been the silent Trump, the one who never spoke back despite becoming the target of relentless mockery and criticism simply for being his father's son. Tonight, that would change. If you're enjoying this journey into Barron Trump's defining moment, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful stories that reveal the human side of public figures, stories that mainstream media often overlooks. Hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss our next compelling narrative. As Barron adjusted the microphone, his mind flashed back to the countless headlines that had followed him like shadows. The cruel memes about his appearance during his early teen years. The speculation about his personality and intelligence from people who had never met him. The vicious comments suggesting he was damaged or abnormal because he preferred privacy over the spotlight. His fingers tightened around the edge of the podium, the cool wood grounding him in the present moment. He could feel his heartbeat pulsing in his fingertips, the slight tremor in his hands invisible to the audience but thunderous in his own awareness. The taste of mint from his last-minute breath freshener lingered on his tongue, a small comfort in the face of what he was about to do. "Thank you for coming tonight," he began, his voice deeper than many expected, steady despite the butterflies rioting in his stomach. "I recognize the irony that I'm speaking at a debate about whether children of political figures should be criticized, when I've spent most of my life as exactly that, a criticized child of a political figure." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. In the front row, Professor Harrington, the debate moderator and one of Harvard's most respected political science professors, watched with narrowed eyes. She had made no secret of her disdain for the Trump family, having written several scathing academic papers on his father's presidency. "Before I begin my formal arguments," Barron continued, "I'd like to share something personal." The room stilled. This wasn't part of the debate format they had expected. "When I was 13 years old, I came across a late-night comedy show while channel surfing. The host was making jokes about me, speculating that I might be autistic because I was quiet in public appearances. The audience was laughing. I wasn't." His words hung in the air like a physical presence. No one moved. That same week, my school classmates shared memes mocking my height, my expressions, my mannerisms. I received messages suggesting I was everything from mentally unstable to a future serial killer, all because I was tall, reserved, and had the last name Trump. In the third row, a young woman with bright blue hair shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Barron had noticed her earlier, the creator of a particularly viral TikTok series mocking the Trump family, her caricature of him especially biting, her eyes now fixed on the floor. Professor Harrington cleared her throat, clearly wanting to redirect back to the formal debate structure, but Barron continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing this because today's debate isn't theoretical for me. It's my life. It has been my life since I was 10 years old." The tension in the room was palpable now, crackling like static electricity. Some audience members appeared genuinely affected by his words, while others maintained skeptical expressions, arms crossed defensively across their chests. So before we dive into the philosophical arguments about freedom of speech versus protection of minors, I want to ask each of you a simple question. Would you want your childhood scrutinized, criticized, and mocked by millions of strangers who have never met you? The blue-haired student's fingers had stopped scrolling on her phone. Her face had drained of color. Would you want your awkward teen years immortalized in memes? Your growth spurts, your acne, your fashion choices turned into national punchlines? Barron paused, letting the question sink in. The strategy was deliberate, making the theoretical personal before launching into his actual debate points. He needed them to see him as human first, a Trump second. Now, I understand the counter-arguments. My father chose public life. He is a controversial figure who has said and done things that have deeply hurt and angered many people. I am not here to defend his politics or his statements. This acknowledgement visibly surprised many in the audience. Several people who had been sitting with defensive postures straightened up, their expressions shifting from hostility to cautious interest. But at 10 years old, I didn't choose any of this. No child chooses their parents. No child chooses to become a public figure. And I believe that's the crucial distinction we need to make in this debate. Professor Harrington finally intervened. Mr. Trump, while your personal experiences are indeed relevant, we should move to the structured format of tonight's debate. Your opponent, Ms. Winters, will now present her opening arguments. Across the stage stood Eliza Winters, president of the Campus Democrats and a fierce debater with national recognition. Her expression was unreadable as she approached her podium. Thank you, Professor Harrington, she began smoothly. While I acknowledge Mr. Trump's personal experiences, we must separate emotion from principle in this discussion. For the next 10 minutes, Eliza delivered a polished argument about how public figures and their families operated in a different sphere of privacy expectations, how the media's right to commentary extended to all aspects of public life, and how children of politicians benefited from privilege and power that justified additional scrutiny. It was a technically perfect debate performance. Under normal circumstances, it might have swayed the room, but tonight felt different. The audience kept glancing back at Barron, who listened intently without interrupting, his face composed but his eyes reflecting each point like arrows finding their mark. When it was his turn to respond, Barron stood again. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Ms. Winters makes compelling points about the nature of public life, he began, nodding respectfully toward his opponent. And if we were debating whether adult family members who actively participate in political activities should expect privacy, I might even agree with her. This admission of potential common ground caused a murmur of surprise. But that's not what we're discussing today. We're talking about children, human beings who are still developing their sense of self, their confidence, their place in the world. He stepped slightly away from the podium, a deliberate movement that made him seem less formal, more authentic. Research in developmental psychology, which I've studied extensively since entering Harvard, shows that public humiliation and criticism during formative years can cause lasting trauma. It can lead to anxiety disorders, depression, and in extreme cases, self-harm. This isn't theoretical, it's well-documented science. The audience was fully engaged now, the earlier hostility giving way to genuine attention. Even Professor Harrington had stopped checking her watch. But beyond the psychological impact, there's a more fundamental question at stake. What kind of society do we want to be? One that protects those who cannot protect themselves? Or one that sacrifices children's well-being on the altar of political entertainment? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. In the third row, the blue-haired critic had put her phone away entirely, her eyes never leaving Barron's face. Ms. Winters correctly points out that I've benefited from privilege. I acknowledge that. I've had opportunities and securities that most people don't. But privilege doesn't immunize against pain. Wealth doesn't shield a child from the psychological impact of being called creepy, weird, or damaged by adults who have never spoken a single word to them. An uncomfortable silence settled over the audience. Many were confronting their own past comments about him or other political children, examining them in a new light. Then came the moment that would later be described as the turning point. Barron reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "This is something I've never shared publicly before," he said, his voice softer now. "When I was 14, I started keeping a list of every major comment made about me in national media and by public figures. Not because I wanted to hold grudges, but because I was trying to understand what I was doing wrong. Why so many adults seemed to dislike me without knowing me." He opened the notebook, the pages visibly filled with tight, precise handwriting. "There are 327 entries in this book, comments about my appearance, my intelligence, my supposed emotional problems, speculations about whether I hate my father, whether I'm being abused, whether I'm on the spectrum, jokes about my height, my posture, my expressions. The auditorium was completely silent now. Even the usual coughs and shuffles had ceased. What's remarkable is that during the period covered by this notebook, I had spoken exactly 0 words in public. Not in interviews, not in speeches, not on social media. These 327 judgments were based entirely on how I looked in photographs or how I stood during events I was required to attend. Eliza Winters, his debate opponent, had gone very still at her podium, her prepared counter-arguments suddenly seeming hollow in the face of this reality. So my question is simple. Is this what we stand for as a society? Judging children based on their parentage rather than their character? Making determinations about their worth, their mental health, their personality based on silent video clips and still photos? Barron closed the notebook and returned it to his jacket. I believe we're better than that. I have to believe we're better than that. Because if we're not, if we truly think it's acceptable to target children for the sins or controversies of their parents, then we've abandoned one of the most fundamental principles of justice, that individuals should be judged by their own actions, not by circumstances beyond their control. The tension in the room had transformed into something else entirely, a collective reckoning, an uncomfortable self-examination. Professor Harrington glanced at her notes, then set them aside, abandoning the strict debate format as she recognized something more important was happening. Ms. Winters, would you like to respond? She asked quietly. Eliza approached her microphone slowly, her usual confidence visibly shaken. She began, then stopped. The auditorium waited. I came here tonight with statistics about media coverage and legal precedents about public figures. But I realize now that those arguments miss something essential. She looked directly at Barron for the first time. I've been one of those critics, not professionally but personally. I've reposted memes, I've laughed at jokes, I've made assumptions, and I did it without ever considering that on the receiving end was a real person, a child, and then a teenager who was reading and hearing all of it. The admission seemed to cost her something, but also to free her from something. So rather than continuing to debate theoretical points, I want to say publicly, I was wrong, not just about this debate topic, but in my actions. And I apologize. The words fell into a silence so complete you could hear the building's heating system humming in the background. This wasn't just unexpected. It was unprecedented in the cutthroat world of Harvard debate. Barron's expression softened. Thank you, he said simply. That takes courage. For a moment, the two stood looking at each other across the stage, political opponents connected by a moment of genuine human understanding. Professor Harrington, sensing the significance of what was unfolding, made an unusual decision. I think we would all benefit from hearing more from Mr. Trump, not as a debater, but as someone with unique insight into this issue. If you're willing to continue sharing your perspective. Barron nodded, stepping back up to the podium. But instead of staying behind it, he moved to the front of the stage, sitting on its edge. A deliberate breaking of formality. I'm not angry at the people who criticize me, he said, his voice conversational now rather than formal. I understand the context. My father is one of the most polarizing figures in modern American politics. People have strong feelings about him, both positive and negative. He ran a hand through his hair, a small human gesture that made him suddenly seem younger, more vulnerable. What I hope we can all agree on is that children shouldn't be collateral damage in political warfare. Not Trump children, not Biden grandchildren, not Obama daughters. No child deserves to grow up being told they look disturbed or strange by adults with political agendas. Something shifted in the room. A collective exhale, a lowering of defenses. I'm not asking for special treatment or immunity from criticism as an adult. I'm 19 now. I'm choosing to speak publicly. I'll make mistakes, say things people disagree with, take positions that may be controversial. That's fair game. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. But can we agree to draw a line at children? Can we as a society decide that regardless of how we feel about a politician, their minor children are off limits for mockery, speculation, and cruelty? The question seemed to resonate through the auditorium, bouncing off walls and finding purchase in unexpected places. The blue-haired critic in the third row was openly wiping tears from her eyes now. A professor known for his scathing anti-Trump editorials was nodding slowly, thoughtfully. I believe this isn't actually a political issue, Barron continued. It's a human one. It's about who we want to be as a society, what values we want to uphold regardless of party affiliation. Professor Harrington, moved despite herself, asked, "What would you say to those who argue that public scrutiny is simply the price of political power, that it comes with the territory?" Barron considered this, taking his time. "I would say that adults who choose political careers can make that calculation for themselves, but their children never signed that contract. Their children never got to decide whether the benefits of power were worth the cost of scrutiny." He stood up, returning to his full height, a physical reminder of how quickly he had been forced to grow up in the public eye. "And I would add that cruel commentary about children doesn't hold politicians accountable. It just hurts kids. It doesn't advance policy debates or expose corruption. It just tells young people that they're fair game for adult ridicule based on circumstances they didn't choose." The words settled over the audience like a gentle but insistent rain, seeping past defenses and preconceptions. "So what's your proposed solution?" Professor Harrington asked, genuinely curious now rather than confrontational. "A new social contract," Barron replied without hesitation. "One where media outlets, political commentators, comedians, and yes, social media users agree to basic principles regarding children of public figures. No mockery of their appearance. No speculation about their mental health or intelligence. No sexualization. No using them as props to attack their parents." He swept his gaze across the audience. "This isn't censorship. It's decency. We already have similar unwritten rules about other vulnerable groups. I'm simply suggesting we extend that same basic human respect to children in the political spotlight." Something remarkable was happening in the auditorium. People who had entered with firmly entrenched political views were nodding in agreement. The divisiveness that had charged the atmosphere at the beginning of the evening had transformed into something rarer: consensus. "I never chose to be a Trump," Barron said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "But I did choose to come here tonight, to finally use my voice, not to complain or seek sympathy, but to ask all of us, regardless of political affiliation, to be better to the next generation of children who find themselves thrust into the political spotlight." He surveyed the room once more. "Because ultimately, how we treat society's most vulnerable members, including children who didn't choose their parents, says nothing about them and everything about us." The silence that followed was profound, stretching for several heartbeats. Then in the back of the auditorium, someone began to applaud. The sound was joined by another pair of hands, then another, spreading across the room like wildfire until everyone was on their feet. Liberals and conservatives, professors and students, media representatives, and campus activists united, if only for this moment, in recognition of a simple human truth. Professor Harrington made no attempt to restore order or return to the debate format. Some truths transcend debate points. Some moments matter more than winning arguments. As the applause continued, the blue-haired critic made her way to the stage, phone in hand. With tears still visible on her cheeks, she showed Barron her screen. She was deleting the entire TikTok series that had mocked him and his family. "I'm sorry," she said, barely audible over the applause, "and thank you for making me see differently." Barron nodded, giving her a small, genuine smile. "That's all I hope for tonight. Not agreement on politics, just recognition of our shared humanity." As he left the stage, the standing ovation continued. But what mattered more than the applause was the conversations beginning throughout the auditorium, people from opposite political spectrums talking to each other, finding common ground in the simple principle that children deserve protection regardless of their last names. Barron Trump had entered Harvard as the silent Trump, the one who never spoke back despite years of public scrutiny. He left the debate stage having found his voice, not in anger or retaliation, but in a call for compassion that transcended political divisions. And in doing so, he didn't just change the tenor of a campus debate, he changed hearts and minds. Because some messages are powerful enough to break through even the strongest partisan armor, especially when delivered with courage, authenticity, and grace. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever judged someone based on their family rather than their individual character? Or have you been on the receiving end of such judgment? Your stories matter too. Thank you for joining us for this powerful moment of reflection. And remember, how we treat the most vulnerable among us defines who we are as individuals and as a society.